Serving in the armed forces is widely recognized as an act of courage, of patriotism, and of duty to one's country. Among other reasons, it is a career that carries with it an unpredictable degree of risk and danger. Our story today is true, as recounted by an American veteran, once a young specialist in the United States Army. For the sake of anonymity, we will call him David. While many soldiers leave active service with both physical and psychological scars, in 1987 young David would leave Fort Hood with something heavier, something that followed him home. Back in the 80s, with the Vietnam War only a decade behind, the shadow of that conflict still hung in every hallway and classroom across America. Kids grew up with it on their television sets and in their textbooks. They saw footage of Hueys strafing tree lines, men covered in mud, men who never came home. By the time David was old enough to enlist, he carried all of that with him. He was eager to prove that his generation could stand in the same line of warriors that his uncles and older cousins had walked before him. David served from 1984 to 1988. His first duty station had been with an engineering battalion, but after a short deployment in Central America, he was reassigned to the 1st Cavalry Division at Fort Hood, Texas. Fort Hood was the biggest military installation in the country, stretching across nearly 215,000 acres. It was larger than some cities in America, almost its own world. It contained live fire ranges, endless back roads, miles of thick brush and oak groves that swallowed sound at night. That mattered because, unlike the cities it dwarfed, Fort Hood had entire sections that looked and felt like unbroken wilderness. Those were the places David ended up working more than he ever expected. His original occupation was communications. He repaired radios and worked in climate-controlled shops that smelled of solder and oil. He thought he would spend most of his enlistment with a wrench in one hand and a manual in the other. Instead, he found himself pulled into a temporary duty assignment with the MPs, the military police, in the spring of 1987. Because of shortages and rotations, David was tasked with security patrols, night shifts through the darker corners of the installation. At first, he did not mind it at all. If anything, he welcomed it. He had grown up in small-town Texas, not too far from Killeen, so the dusty back roads, the cicadas, and the open sky filled with stars felt familiar, even comforting. While others dreaded being paired for those lonely patrols, David felt it gave him purpose. He could roll along a dirt trail with nothing but the hum of the truck engine and the whisper of wind through mesquite trees, and feel like he was doing something worthwhile. Fort Hood had thousands of buildings and storage yards scattered like islands across its enormous footprint. The MPs were tasked with checking fences, gates, and abandoned properties, making sure no trespassers had wandered in from nearby towns. Sometimes it meant rattling a lock on a forgotten motor pool. Sometimes it meant driving for 20 minutes to reach a lonely lot filled with rusted equipment. Most nights were uneventful, routine, so quiet that he and his partner would talk about everything from home life to rumors about deployments. But every soldier stationed there knew there was one lot that made the hair rise on the back of your neck, even in daylight. It was a massive fenced-in area tucked away beyond a series of gravel roads, surrounded by cedar brakes and brush taller than a man. The lot stretched wide enough to fit several football fields inside. Behind the 12-foot chain-link fence were rows of abandoned cars, many stripped by time. Their tires were rotted, their glass long gone, their seats eaten away by weather and dust. Some of the older sergeants said those cars had belonged to men who left for Vietnam and never came back. KIA or MIA. Families never claimed them, so the Army parked them here and left them forgotten. Whatever the truth, that place carried a weight to it. A sadness. At night, the silence that settled over it was deep enough to make your pulse throb in your ears. The assignment was simple. Drive the perimeter. Shine the mounted spotlight through the fence. Check the locks and move on. But in June of 1987, something happened inside that lot that David could never put away again. It began as so many nights did, a long, slow roll across the cracked pavement, headlights bouncing against twisted car frames, the smell of hot metal wafting in from the hood of the patrol truck. David sat in the passenger seat. His partner that night, a wiry kid named Harlan, drove with one hand on the wheel, the other fiddling with the spotlight toggle. "Do you see that?" Harlan asked. squinting into the darkness. David leaned forward. At first he saw nothing but shapes upon shapes, shadows among shadows. Then something shifted. A silhouette darted low across the far end of the lot, quick and deliberate. "It is probably an animal," David said, but the tone of his own voice betrayed him. "No animal moves like that," Harlan muttered, already swinging the spotlight across the rows of dead cars. The beam of light cut across the rusted skeletons of cars. Windows gaped like missing eyes. Metal frames leaned at odd angles, eaten by years of rain and heat. David felt his chest tighten as the spotlight swept back and forth. There was nothing, just silence pressing against the glass of the truck. "Maybe it ducked down," Harlan said. He slowed the vehicle and leaned out slightly, his elbow on the door. The spotlight shook as his hand trembled against the toggle. David had seen coyotes out here, sometimes wild dogs, even the occasional deer, but this movement had been sharp and human, controlled, the sort of quick low dash you made when you were trying not to be seen. "We need to check the fence," David said finally. His voice came out dry. Harlan nodded. He brought the truck to a slow stop near the perimeter gate. The padlock hung there, dull under the light, still closed, still chained. The beam rolled across the fence line. That was when David saw it again. Between two stripped sedans, something crouched. The spotlight slid past it, but in that second David caught the outline of a figure. It was pressed low, knees bent, shoulders drawn up, its head tilted toward the truck. For the briefest heartbeat he swore he saw eyes reflecting pale light back at him. "Stop, right there, go back," David hissed. Harlan reversed the beam, but the gap was empty. Just hollow car frames, just darkness. "You are seeing things," Harlan muttered. He reached for the radio clipped to his vest. "We could call this in." David shook his head. "If it is just an animal, we will look like idiots." He forced his own hand steady as he gripped the door handle. "We check it on foot, quick in and out." The fence screeched as the gate rolled wide enough for them to slip through. Their boots crunched on gravel, each step echoing too loudly in the vast stillness. The rows of cars rose around them like gravestones, silent, corroded, forgotten. The smell was the first thing that unsettled him. It was more than rust or dust. It was damp, earthy, and wrong, like soil freshly turned after rain, but with something sour underneath, something that clung in the back of his throat. They moved slowly, flashlights cutting narrow tunnels through the darkness. Shadows recoiled against the beams, but always rushed back to fill the spaces behind them. Halfway down the row, David heard it, a metallic tap, light, sharp, like a finger brushing against steel. He froze, lifting his hand to stop Harlan. The sound came again, this time from their left. The beam of his flashlight cut through an open car frame. Empty seats, shattered dashboard, nothing else. But the tap came once more, and this time it was followed by the faint scrape of movement. "Who is there?" Harlan called out. His voice cracked in the night air. There was no answer, only the whisper of wind through broken glass. David's heart pounded against his chest. He stepped forward, the beam of his light trembling. The car frames seemed to lean closer as they pressed deeper into the lot. Then the sound came again. Not tapping this time, breathing, low, slow, right ahead of them. David raised his flashlight. In that circle of light, something stood. It was tall, too tall to be a man crouching. Thin limbs hung unnaturally long at its sides. Its face was pale, washed of color, with eyes that reflected like mirrors in the beam. For a moment, David thought it wore a torn uniform, but then the details seemed to shift. Fabric melted into shadow. The outline blurred as though the figure was not fixed in place. Harlan swore loudly and stumbled back. His light snapped upward, catching empty air. When it landed again, the figure was gone. They both turned in circles, beams shaking wildly across metal carcasses. Nothing, only silence again, only the smell of damp earth and dust. "Let's get out," David whispered. His throat was dry. His skin felt cold even in the Texas heat. They did not run, but their steps quickened, crunching against the gravel. When they reached the gate again, Harlan fumbled with the chain, hands slick with sweat. The lock clanged shut behind them as the gate rattled closed. Back in the truck, neither spoke. Harlan kept glancing into the rearview mirror as if expecting something to be following. David kept his eyes locked on the lot, watching rows of shadowed cars vanish behind them as they drove. When they reported the patrol at shift's end, they said nothing about the figure, nothing about the eyes. They simply marked the lot as checked, secure, nothing unusual to report. But David knew something had been there, something that did not belong. He carried it with him into daylight, and it waited for him the next night. David had always thought of himself as rational. He grew up with church on Sundays, football on Fridays, and long summer nights under the Texas stars. His father was a mechanic. His mother worked in the school cafeteria. There was nothing mystical or unusual about his upbringing. By the time he put on the uniform, he considered himself steady, practical, and unshaken by stories meant to spook kids around campfires. Yet after that night in June of 1987, something shifted inside him. Sleep no longer came easily. When it did, it carried with it strange dreams. He dreamed of standing inside the lot again, staring down endless rows of hollow vehicles. In the dreams, he heard the scrape of metal, always just behind him. When he turned, he never saw anything. He always woke with sweat dampening his shirt, his heart racing as if he had been running. His partner Harlan avoided him for a few days after. When they did cross paths at the mess hall, Harlan kept his head low, muttering a quick greeting before slipping away. David suspected the younger soldier was trying to bury the memory, to lock it down so it would not surface again. David tried the same. He lifted weights in the gym, took long runs in the heat, and lost himself in routine maintenance duties when not assigned to night patrols. But Fort Hood did not let things go so easily. The base was enormous, and it had a reputation. Every soldier there had heard stories whispered in the barracks or passed around during training. Some claimed to see strange lights over the ranges late at night. Others swore they had heard phantom footsteps trailing them on wooded back roads. A few even spoke of entire barracks buildings that gave men chills the moment they walked through the doors. Most laughed it off, chalking it up to stress, exhaustion, or wild imaginations. But David noticed how the laughter always carried an edge of unease, like men trying to convince themselves. One evening, about a week after the incident, David was assigned again to the same sector. His stomach tightened as soon as he saw the coordinates printed on the duty roster. That cursed lot, the one with the abandoned cars. This time his partner was different. A stocky sergeant named Keller rode shotgun. Keller was older, close to 30, with a permanent scowl carved into his face. He had already done a deployment overseas and carried himself with the kind of weight that younger soldiers rarely questioned. They drove the truck in silence at first, tires crunching over gravel. The cicadas screamed in the trees, filling the night air with their endless drone. David gripped the wheel a little too tight, trying not to let Keller notice. "You have been on this route before?" Keller asked eventually. His voice was low, flat, almost bored. "Yeah," David answered. He forced his tone even. "About a week ago." "Anything unusual?" Keller pressed. His eyes were on the darkness outside, scanning the brush and fence lines. David hesitated. He thought of the pale face, the mirrored eyes, the way it had vanished as soon as light struck it. He thought of Harlan's trembling hands on the lock. "No," David lied. "Nothing worth mentioning." Keller gave a short grunt, as if satisfied. They continued toward the lot. When the fence came into view, David felt his throat tighten. The rows of abandoned cars stood like skeletal sentinels behind the chain link. The truck headlights washed over them, catching glints of metal that shone like bones. Keller leaned forward, adjusting the spotlight. The beam swept across the lot in deliberate arcs. "Looks clear," Keller muttered. "We check the gate, log it, and move." David nodded. He pulled the truck to a stop. Together they stepped out, boots sinking into loose gravel. The air was heavy with heat, though a faint breeze carried through the trees. For a moment, everything seemed still. Then came the sound. It was faint at first, almost lost beneath the hum of insects. A low, dragging scrape. Metal against metal. It echoed from deep within the lot. Keller froze, his head tilted slightly, listening. What the hell was that? David's pulse quickened. He forced himself to stay steady. Could be the wind, or something shifting in the cars. But even as he said it, he knew it was not true. The sound had rhythm, intention. It came again, slower this time, as if whatever caused it wanted them to hear. Keller's hand moved to the pistol on his hip. "We go in." David swallowed hard. The memory of the figure flooded back, but he followed Keller through the gate anyway. The chain rattled as it swung shut behind them. They walked side by side, flashlights slicing into the shadows. The rows of cars seemed endless. Hollow frames leaned against one another, their interiors gutted, their steel bones left bare. The air smelled of rust and earth, sharp and stale. The scrape came again, louder, closer. Keller swept his light toward the sound. The beam landed on a car near the far row. Its trunk lid was half open, rusted hinges sagging. Something moved inside. "Step back," Keller ordered. He drew his sidearm, the metallic click loud in the silence. The trunk lid shuddered, then it slammed shut with a force that made both men flinch. The bang echoed across the lot, bouncing from frame to frame until it sounded like dozens of doors slamming at once. David's breath caught in his throat. He turned his light toward the noise, but the trunk was still now. Perfectly still. Keller cursed under his breath. His pistol remained raised, his finger tight on the trigger. "Animal my ass," he muttered. They stood there, frozen in the dark, the beams of their flashlights trembling. David felt eyes on him again, not from one place, but from everywhere at once. The rows of cars seemed to lean in, watching, listening. A sudden clang rang out from behind them. Both spun, lights snapping across metal. Empty, only shadows. "Enough," Keller barked. He shoved his pistol back into the holster. "We are done here." Neither argued. They walked quickly back to the gate, not running but close. When they stepped outside the lot again, David felt the air lighten, as if a weight had been left behind. Back in the truck, Keller said nothing. He simply marked the lot as secure, same as David had a week before. But the silence that followed them on the drive back was heavy. David knew then that Keller had seen enough to understand. That night, David lay awake in his bunk long after lights out. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the air unit, his body rigid with tension. The lot was not just abandoned vehicles. It was not just forgotten metal and rust. Something lived in there, something that moved with purpose, that watched with intent, and worst of all, it wanted to be noticed. The following week blurred into drills, maintenance checks, and long Texas heat. But David carried the lot with him everywhere he went. He saw it when he closed his eyes. He smelled it when the air turned damp after a storm. He felt it in the uneasy quiet before dawn, when the barracks seemed too still. He thought Keller might have spoken to others about what they witnessed, but the sergeant kept silent. He never mentioned the scraping sound or the trunk lid slamming shut. On paper, the patrol log was clean, nothing unusual, secure. But the look in Keller's eyes during the shift change said otherwise. Some men hide fear with jokes, others bury it under silence. Keller had chosen silence. A few nights later, David was off duty and lying in his bunk when he heard voices down the hall. Low, urgent. He recognized one as Harlan's. The other belonged to a soldier named Diaz. Both had been assigned patrols in the same sector that week. "Something moved out there," Harlan hissed. "I swear to God it was watching us." Diaz's reply was too soft to catch, but the tremor in his voice carried even at a distance. David closed his eyes. The pattern was clear now. Whatever haunted that lot was not tied to one soldier or one night. It lingered there, waiting for anyone who stepped too close. The following evening, David drew another night shift. This time he was paired with Private Collins, a kid barely 19, fresh out of training. Collins was eager, full of nervous energy. He spoke in rapid bursts as they rolled out in the truck, rambling about girlfriends back home and how he could not wait to buy his first car. David nodded and gave half-hearted responses, his mind already dreading where the patrol would lead them. As luck would have it, their route circled wide across the installation, through supply yards and deserted admin buildings. For nearly 2 hours, nothing happened. David began to relax, letting the drone of Collins's chatter and the steady hum of the engine lull his nerves. But then Collins glanced at the duty sheet again and grinned. "Last stop, the vehicle lot. They say it is haunted, you know." David's stomach sank. "Haunted," David repeated flatly. "Yeah," Collins said, his eyes gleaming in the glow of the dashboard. "Some of the guys in my platoon swear they saw things moving out there. Ghost soldiers or something. One guy said he heard whispers." David said nothing. He kept his eyes on the road, watching the brush swallow the headlights as they approached. When the fence finally came into view, Collins leaned forward, his grin fading slightly. The rows of abandoned cars rose behind the chain link, pale under the moonlight. They looked endless, stretching back into the shadows, each frame hollow and waiting. David slowed the truck. His pulse quickened. The lot seemed alive with silence, heavier than anywhere else on base. "Protocol," David said, his voice tight. "We check the perimeter, then we are done." Collins nodded. His earlier excitement had drained away. His hands fidgeted with the spotlight toggle. As they rolled past the gate, the beam cut across the cars. For a moment, David thought he saw movement again, a shape slipping between frames. He blinked hard. Nothing, just rust and shadow. They stopped at the far corner of the fence. Collins leaned out with his flashlight, scanning the lock. Still shut, still chained. Then it came. A whisper, soft, drawn out, carried on the night air. David froze. The sound did not belong to the wind. It was a voice, low and breathy, speaking words he could not understand. "Did you hear that?" Collins whispered. His face had gone pale. David nodded slowly. His heart thudded in his chest. He opened the door, boots crunching on gravel. The whisper came again, this time from deeper inside the lot. He lifted his flashlight. The beam swept across the first row. Empty frames, torn seats, nothing else. Collins stepped out beside him. His light shook in his hand. It sounded like someone calling. David swallowed hard. He forced his voice steady. "Stay close." They moved along the fence, flashlights carving narrow paths through the dark. The whispers rose and fell, sometimes close, sometimes distant. They seemed to shift with every step, as if circling them. At one point, David swore he heard his own name. A soft murmur, drawn out like a sigh. He spun, light slashing across shadows. Nothing. Only empty car husks staring back. Collins' breathing grew ragged. "I don't like this," he muttered. "We should leave." Before David could answer, a sharp metallic crash erupted from the center of the lot. Both beams snapped toward the sound. One of the car doors had slammed shut with violent force. The echo rolled across the yard, bouncing from frame to frame until it sounded like dozens of doors slamming in unison. Collins yelped and stumbled back. His flashlight beam darted wildly. David steadied his own. For the briefest instant, he saw a pale face behind a shattered windshield. It was gone before he could focus, leaving only glass shards that glinted like teeth. "That's it," Collins gasped. "We are done." David did not argue. They retreated to the truck, boots pounding the gravel. The whispers trailed them all the way, weaving through the night air. When they slammed the doors shut, David locked his eyes forward, refusing to glance at the mirror. Collins fumbled with the spotlight, hands shaking so hard he could barely switch it off. They drove in silence, both pale and wide-eyed. When they returned to the MP station, Collins said nothing in the debrief. Neither did David. But that night, lying in his bunk, David realized the truth. The whispers were not random. They were not meaningless. They had shape. They had intent. They wanted to be heard. And he feared that if he listened long enough, he might begin to understand them. The lot never left David's mind. Days bled into nights, yet every detail replayed when the lights dimmed and the barracks fell silent. The whispers were worse than the figure or the slammed trunk because they suggested intent. Something wanted attention. Something wanted to be known. Collins avoided him after their patrol. The young private had turned quiet, shadows under his eyes betraying sleepless nights. When David passed him in the mess hall, Collins muttered a greeting and quickly moved on. The silence between them said more than words. Both had seen, both had heard, and neither dared speak it aloud. But whispers on the lot were not confined to that chain-link boundary. Within a week, men in other units began murmuring about strange things on the perimeter roads. Unexplained lights darting between trees. Unnatural silence swallowing the night. Footsteps where no one walked. One evening, Keller pulled David aside after roll call. His face was drawn, his jaw set. "You ever see shadows that don't move right?" Keller asked quietly. David felt a chill. "Where?" "South Fence Road, just past the fuel depot. I thought it was a guy at first. Tall, real still. I called out, but it didn't answer. Then when I stepped closer, it slid back into the trees. Didn't walk, didn't run, just slid." David said nothing. He didn't need to. Keller's eyes carried the same dread David had felt at the lot, the same heaviness that clung to him like damp air. That night, David was once again assigned to the southern sector. His partner was Specialist Bryant, a steady man who rarely spoke unless necessary. Bryant had the calm of someone who had already seen too much in life and was beyond surprise. They rolled past the fuel depot, headlights sweeping across towering tanks and long shadows. The hum of the truck filled the silence. Beyond the chain-link fence, the woods loomed. Halfway down the road, David spotted it, a figure between the trees. "Stop," he muttered. Bryant slowed. His eyes narrowed. "You see it too." The shape stood 30 yards out just beyond the first line of trees. Tall, upright, still as stone. David flicked on the spotlight. The beam cut across branches, but the figure seemed untouched. It remained in shadow, darker than the night itself. "Could be a soldier," Bryant offered, but his voice lacked conviction. David leaned out the window. "Soldier, identify yourself." No response. The figure did not move. Bryant honked the horn once. The echo rolled into the trees. Still nothing. Then the figure slid backward, deeper into the woods. Not with steps, not with movement. It simply retreated, gliding soundlessly until it melted into the darkness. David's hand clenched the door handle. He wanted to get out, to chase it, to prove it was human. But every instinct screamed no. Bryant shifted gears. "Not our problem tonight." His voice was low but steady. David exhaled and nodded. They drove on, but his pulse refused to slow. The rest of the patrol passed without incident, though David felt eyes on him every mile. When they returned to the MP station, he waited for Bryant to bring it up in the log. But like the others before him, Bryant wrote nothing unusual, just another uneventful night. That silence became the rule. The more soldiers saw, the less they spoke. Everyone knew something stirred along the perimeters, but to acknowledge it meant questions, evaluations, maybe worse. 2 nights later, David pulled another shift with Collins. The younger private had grown pale and restless, his chatter gone, his energy hollow. He jumped at small noises. His flashlight beam shook when he held it. They were assigned to sweep near the training grounds, a stretch of back road lined with thick brush. The moon hung thin, casting little light. As they rounded a bend, Collins stiffened. "Stop. Look." David braked. Ahead, in the middle of the road, stood a shadow. It was taller than any man. Its arms hung too long, nearly reaching its knees. The head was featureless, swallowed in darkness. David flicked the high beams. The figure remained. Collins whispered, "What is that?" The figure tilted its head slowly, unnaturally, as if studying them. Every hair on David's body stood on end. He gripped the wheel tight, fighting the urge to slam the gas. Without warning, the shadow split. The single figure blurred, then divided into 3. All identical, all standing in the road. Collins gasped. His hands clawed at his rifle. "Oh my God!" David forced himself to stay steady. He pressed the accelerator gently. The truck crept forward. The shadows did not move. "Keep going," David muttered. As the truck drew closer, the figures melted into the air, dissolving like smoke. By the time they reached the spot, the road was empty. Collins sagged against his seat, trembling. They weren't real. They couldn't be real. David said nothing. His heart hammered, but his face stayed hard. When they returned to the station, Collins excused himself quickly, avoiding everyone's eyes. David watched him go, knowing the boy would never sleep easy again. That night, David lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The whispers, the faces, the shadows, all separate, yet connected. The lot was no longer the only source. The entire base felt infected. Something lingered on the edges, feeding on fear. He thought of the old cars again. The rusted frames of soldiers who never came back. Were these shadows tied to them? Echoes of men left behind, or something older? Something that had always been here, waiting for Fort Hood to spread across its ground. Sleep never came. Only the memory of shadows gliding between trees, heads tilting in silent judgment. David understood one thing clearly. The perimeter was no longer secure, and Fort Hood was holding something it could never contain. By the end of October, the base was humming with nervous silence. No one admitted it out loud, but everyone felt it. Men smoked longer at the edges of the barracks. Patrol logs grew thinner, stripped of detail. Soldiers walked faster at night, shoulders hunched, eyes darting toward shadows they pretended not to see. David lived inside that tension. He stopped expecting rest. Nights stretched into a haze of coffee and adrenaline, each shift another test of how long his nerves would hold. Keller, Collins, Bryant, even the loudmouths, they all carried the same hollow look now. Fort Hood's night crews were a collection of pale faces, lit only by the red glow of dashboard lights. It was during one of those shifts, a cold evening with the wind cutting sharp through the trees, that everything broke open. David had been paired again with Keller. The two drove slow along the eastern road, a lonely stretch skirting a training range long abandoned. The land was rough here, broken by thickets and shallow ravines. The night felt heavy, the air thick, not storm thick, not weather thick. Different. The world itself seemed to hold its breath. Halfway down the road, the truck sputtered. Keller cursed and tapped the gauge. "Tank's fine," he muttered. The engine whined, coughed, and died. They rolled to a stop. Silence fell, pressing in from all sides. David tried the ignition. Nothing. Not even a click. The dashboard lights dimmed to black. Keller pulled his rifle close. Great, dead in the middle of nowhere. David felt it before he saw it. The sensation of being watched. The pressure on the back of his neck. Then came the sound. A low hum, almost below hearing, vibrating through the truck frame. Keller froze. "You hear that?" David nodded slowly. The hum grew louder, a bone-deep vibration, like machinery grinding under the earth. The trees on the roadside shifted, not from wind, from movement. Figures emerged, not one, not three, dozens. They were shadows, taller than men, bodies stretched and wrong, heads bent at unnatural angles, arms dragging, shapes flickering between human and not. The figures surrounded the truck, forming a circle. David's pulse hammered. He gripped his rifle, though some part of him knew bullets would do nothing. One of the shadows stepped closer. It stopped at the driver's window, head tilting. Where a face should be, there was only shifting dark. The hum deepened. David's teeth ached with it. Keller whispered something frantic under his breath, a prayer, maybe, or just words to fill the space. Then the shadow leaned closer. David saw them. Eyes. Dozens of them, swirling inside the dark, opening and closing like wounds, all fixed on him. His breath caught. The world narrowed. Without warning, the headlights blazed to life. The truck roared, engine kicking back with a violent jolt. The circle of shadows recoiled, melting backward into the trees. David slammed the accelerator. The tires spun dirt and the truck lunged forward, tearing down the road. "Don't stop," Keller barked. "Don't you dare stop." They drove blind, the beam of headlights shaking with every bump. Behind them, the hum followed, fading only when the base lights appeared in the distance. When they finally rolled into the motor pool, both men sat trembling, sweat cold on their necks. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, Keller whispered, "We don't belong out there." David could only nod. He knew Keller was right. Whatever haunted Fort Hood didn't want them near the perimeter. It wanted them afraid. The following nights, David noticed a shift. Patrols were reassigned, routes cut shorter. Command never admitted the reason. but men were quietly kept closer to the center of the base. The outer lots, the old training grounds, the fuel roads, all avoided now. Collins never came back to patrol duty. Word was he'd requested transfer, citing family hardship. Others followed. Rotations thinned. New faces replaced them, fresh men with no idea what waited outside the floodlights. David stayed. He didn't know why. Pride, maybe. Or the sense that leaving would mean surrendering a piece of himself to whatever lurked in the woods. Weeks turned into months. The whispers never stopped. Some nights, faint voices still drifted from the rusted cars in the lot. Some nights, shadows still slid between the trees, just out of reach. But David never saw them gather again, never heard the hum so close. Still, the memory clung. Even years later, long after he left the army, long after Fort Hood became just another chapter, the sound haunted him, the eyes in the dark, the way they fixed on him like prey. He told no one. Not his wife, not his kids, not even the old friends who still wore uniforms. Because how could he? Who would believe that Fort Hood, the pride of Texas, the stronghold of steel and men, was a place that should never have existed in the first place? And yet, late at night, when the house was quiet and the world felt still, David swore he could hear it again. That hum, that vibration crawling up from the earth. As if the shadows had never really stayed behind. As if they'd followed him home. Don't just watch, join us. Subscribe for the next horror story.